Okay, I'm going to get us started. Thank you everybody for joining in. I'm going to introduce myself in a moment, but as you know, you're here for a college planning and admissions 101 with Potomac Oak Tutoring. The agenda for tonight, we are going to be recording this, so that will be sent out at the end, and I will take questions at the end. So if you have questions as we go, put them in the chat, and then I'll be looking, from the top down as we get towards the conclusion of the presentation. So the three main parts of this, we're going to talk a little bit about what admissions officers look for. We're going to talk about what parents of 8th through 10th graders need to know and what parents of 11th and 12th graders need to know. So to get us going, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. I am a consultant with Potomac Oak Tutoring. I have been in the education industry for about 15 years now. I started as an English teacher in Boston Public Schools. I taught AP Lit and 11-12 Honors English, and I was also a guidance counselor. After that, I spent so much time helping students write their college admissions essays that I transitioned to working in admissions at MIT. I loved it so much working there that I thought I wanted to be a dean of admissions at MIT. So I went to grad school hoping to become a dean of admissions, and I ended up right back in high school doing specifically college placement counseling, working with students across various backgrounds to help them find the college that's the perfect fit for them. So a lot of what I do is helping students craft their narrative for college. Grades, obviously, I'm going to talk about that. All that is important. But at the end of the day, when you're an admissions officer and you're reading tons and tons and tons of applications, it's really hard to describe what it is like to sit on a tablet and sift through student essays. It's really the narrative, the full piece that matters in college admissions. So that's why I'm going to be getting a little bit further into that tonight. Okay. So what college admissions are looking for? The obvious ones, right, are the GPA and the weighted GPA. And that means our regular GPA, which is usually out of 4.0 for most schools, and a weighted GPA, that can depend on the school. Sometimes that's out of 5, sometimes it's out of 4.3. But that's what your GPA is when you've taken AP and honors classes. They're usually weighted a little bit more because the academic work is considered to be a little bit more intense. And obviously having the higher GPA, the better, but that's also a very nuanced conversation that I'm going to be getting into further into this presentation. Okay. Another thing that we want to talk about, right, like I get this a lot, like what matters more, GPA, weighted GPA, do I have to take a million honors classes? How many APs do I need to take? So as a guidance counselor and as somebody who studied developmental psych, my answer to this is always that the course load should be appropriate for you and it should be appropriate for the school that you're at. So for example, if you're at a high school where there are a lot of APs, you are probably going to want to take more AP courses if you're looking to get into that top 10, 20, 30, 40 schools, right? So we're talking Ivy Leagues and schools that are kind of like Ivy lateral, right? Like Duke and U Chicago, schools like that. So when you're thinking about the courses that you're going to pick, one of the things that you want to think about is that, are you appropriately challenging yourself? So if you are somebody who's, really interested in studying English, like I was, I started as a journalism major. For me, taking something like an AP calculus wasn't completely necessary for me, and it's not something I would excel in unless I had a lot of additional help. And I didn't have the time for that when I was in high school. So for me, an appropriately challenging course was to be in the calculus class or the honors calculus class. So colleges are looking that you've challenged yourself within the scope of what's offered by your school and that you've challenged yourself appropriately for your skill set. If you have if you're really skilled across the border, or sorry, across the all the borders, and you want to and you find like test taking easy and you have really great time management, then challenge yourself as much as you can, right? But the question we're always going to ask ourselves as admissions officers is, have you challenged yourself appropriately? So that goes for honors and AP courses. Okay, so it's not a numbers game and there's nothing specific there. Okay. Another big question I get is, do I, all the schools are saying they're test optional now. Do I take the ACT versus the SAT? That's a really great question. First of all, colleges accept the ACT and the SAT. For me personally, I don't think it's necessary or a good use of your time to take both exams. So I usually recommend that students stick with one. But if you're, for example, you're in 8th through 10th grade and you're taking things like the pre-ACT and the PSAT 8-9, it can be worth it to try to take one of each exam because you don't know where your skill set is going to lie. So for example, the ACT is an aptitude test. What it does is it says, can you answer this math equation? Can you answer a similar math equation in 30 seconds? So they're saying, can you do this skill quickly? And can you master it repeatedly? That's how the ACT is testing. The SAT, however, is a reasoning test. So it says, okay, here's something you probably would know, but now, for a math problem, for example, the average math problem is 80 words. So that's very different from the ACT where it's more equation oriented. So for the SAT, if you want to move a little slower, but you're kind of decrypting lengthier problems, and that's the exam for you. The ACT is, again, aptitude. It's a much faster exam, but it doesn't require quite as much verbiage for each question. So that's usually how I tell my students to think about it. And then the test optional piece, I'm going to get into that a little bit further, but basically, I thought with COVID that we were going to see the pendulum swing towards more schools going test optional, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Schools that I actually really thought wouldn't use it anymore, I actually thought MIT would go in that direction. MIT was like the second school to bring it back. So as much as I would love to say we're not using testing anymore, it does seem like that is going to be the case. So if you're somebody who's, a little bit worried about taking the test, I highly, highly, highly recommend you get at least one official exam under your belt. I can't state that enough because there are some schools that are going to require it. Georgia, just as a state, is notorious for this. When I was New York City based during the heart of COVID, my students weren't able to take the exam at all. There was no place in New York you could take it. And Georgia would still not give them a pass to apply to their school. So just take the exam. That's my biggest piece of advice. And whether or not you go test optional is something I'm going to get into in a little bit. Okay. So there's also things beyond the GPA and the SAT, ACT that schools are looking at. We call the SAT and the GPA sort of like gatekeepers. There are some colleges that are going to be looking like at your flat out GPA or SAT, ACT as the gatekeeper. I know, in high level admissions, there are, certain scores that, if you're not able to meet that, or if you don't have a certain GPA and you're not contextualizing why you have that GPA, it's going to be difficult for you even to be read by an admissions officer. Okay. But there's a lot of extra pieces that go into this. So a couple of things that I'm going to talk about more in depth again later, but right now we want to talk about extracurriculars. This includes school clubs, outside organizations. So, if you're involved in, like I see a lot of students doing music outside, even sports outside of their school, internships, work experience, volunteer service. This all matters. Colleges now, especially colleges that do it's called holistic admissions. It means that they look at all pieces of your application. I've noticed that the trend in the last few years is for colleges to look for students who are more participatory. So if you have, straight A's, perfect test scores, but you're not involved in your school, that tells the school that you might not join in on the activities that they're going to be putting out there for you. And they want you to utilize that because they're trying to educate you, not just academically, but socially. So you want to show those schools that you are willing to engage. For community service, especially, I think a lot of students, especially with like SSL hours and things like that, they feel pressured to get a certain amount done, or they feel like they have to do community service at a lot of different places. That's not necessarily the case. So if you look at the key aspects of extracurricular involvement below, Schools would prefer longevity and depth of involvement over lots of involvement in different things. So, I mean, I have students whose resumes are quite impressive with many, many things they're doing. And again, that is, colleges will like that. But it's really the students who have put in a lot of time and effort, and you could tell that that it means something to them. So maybe they started in band as a freshman and they became a section leader when they were juniors or seniors. With volunteer experience, maybe they started volunteering and then maybe they took on a leadership role, or they started their own volunteer experience. I've had a lot of students who have been deeply involved in efforts with their community, and they bring it to their school. So maybe they ran their own winter coat drive, or they encouraged members or students from their school to come out into the community and meet new community members through their organization. So that kind of stuff, that reflects quite well on the student, because you're saying, not only am I participating in my community, but I'm a community organizer. I'm somebody who is going to bring other students with me. And that's a great thing for colleges, because there's a lot of shy kids who go to college. So the students who can really help pull those other students into activities, that's highly valued among college admissions officers. Another thing that we look for, is internship and work experience. There is like so my students, let's say they're interested in pre-med, right? They'll be like, oh, should I put it on there that I worked at this grocery store? Absolutely. Work is work. And what colleges are looking for now is what I like to call an accounting of time. They're looking to see what students do when they're outside of school. Another big thing that a college application has done, the Common App, they have included family responsibilities in that, which I really appreciate. So for students who maybe have to care for younger siblings, or they've got elderly members of the family, or it's a single parent household and they have to pitch in a little bit more, that is okay to put that in there, because that is how they're using their time. So maybe because they're doing that, they can't participate in other things at school. So I really appreciate that the Common App allows for that. It also allows for faith-based activities. It allows for art and music, and even self-study of things. I've had a lot of students who have done martial arts for years. I have students who have become yoga instructors. All of that matters on there. So the colleges are looking at everything you do and how that narrative, which is what I'm getting to there, sort of aligns with your interests in college, which again, I'll come back to. Other factors that are important in the college application, I cannot say how much the recommendation matters. Now, for students who are at really big schools, college admissions are aware of when, for example, a guidance counselor has maybe like a 1 to 300 ratio. So of course, that guidance counselor might not be able to write as personal a letter as so for example, when I was doing it, I had a 1 to 50 ratio. I knew my students pretty well, but that colleges understand when counselors have bigger or smaller ratios. The teacher recommendations are also so helpful in understanding a student. When we talk about teacher recommendations, generally we recommend that we ask our junior year teachers in core subjects. So most colleges are looking for a recommendation in like math or science, English or history. There are some deviations you can make to that, but you always want to double check with the college and with your guidance counselor. I've had students who are majoring in languages ask a language teacher. I've had students who are majoring in STEM, potentially go with a computer science teacher, but you just have to make sure that it's something that the college will accept. Again, it has to be considered a core subject, something that you have to take. I also get questions fairly frequently about recommendations being going to specific schools. So if you're utilizing what's called the Common App or Naviance, generally a recommendation is written in a general fashion and it goes to all of the schools. If a teacher by accident makes a recommendation specifically for one school, and then all of a sudden that goes out to all of the colleges, you have to be very, very careful about that, because that can diminish your chances at the other colleges if they see another college's name in the recommendation. So if you have a very specific recommendation, maybe one of your teachers was an alum, for an example, you want to speak to your guidance counselor about how to submit that recommendation separately. Because again, if it goes into Naviance, it's most likely going to all of the other schools. Other things that you might have in your profile, you might be an athlete applying into D1, D2, or D3 schools. Musical abilities, talents, again, like martial arts, I see fairly frequently, fencing. So just talking about those particular piece or like art, things like that. If I have any 8th or 10th graders in the room, the biggest thing I can say is start documenting your work early and often. I think the thing that hurts me to see the most is when a college is asking for a portfolio. Even MIT, for example, asks for what's called a maker's portfolio if you want to submit one, and you can show them a portfolio of your work, a portfolio of your art, a portfolio of your music. So you don't want to get to your junior year and all of a sudden you're scrambling to put all of this stuff in a portfolio or to create portfolio materials when you could have just been documenting the entire time. One of my favorite things is to have my art or music students, for example, document what they've done in 9th and 10th grade, and then maybe redo that art piece in 11th or 12th, or try playing that song again and show your growth over time. It's a really interesting thing for admissions officers to see. So if you are an artist or you have something that you've been doing for a really long time, I had somebody who was an equestrian, we documented her over time. That kind of stuff we can submit to a college. And again, it shows growth over time, and colleges really like it because it adds so much value to an application. Another piece that is going to be important to this is the interview. Many of the colleges in the top 20 interview their students. That's something that I frequently help my students with. Legacy is a little bit contentious these days. Legacy means that you have a relative, usually a close relative, who has attended the college before you that you're applying to. I don't know if you guys know about the Supreme Court challenge to this, but the government, it seems to be fairly keen on trying to rid legacy admissions. So there are a few schools that really like it. UPenn is a great example, but I wouldn't rely on legacy so much. So it's great to have legacy. You definitely note it in the college application, but don't rely on it. And the last piece we want to talk about is residency. So for example, UMD is going to favor students from the state, right? But a school like UVA is going to put students from Virginia first. The University of California system is actually the best example of this. If you're applying to them from out of state, they actually require a 3.4 unweighted GPA just to apply into the University of California system. So keep that in mind. So the cycle from last year, the 2021-2022 cycle, this is what, it was an interesting cycle because it really told us a lot about what happened during COVID and how COVID has now affected admissions. As I was saying before, and this is what I want to bring up now, test optional isn't a cause for celebration. Most colleges are reserving test optional for a select few students. Generally, these are students from geographically or socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. So for example, to use again, New York, if a student was a New York resident during the height of the pandemic, colleges were gonna, that was understood that a lot of them couldn't take the exam. But if in places where it was readily available, so for example, like where COVID really hadn't hit because it hit New York first, they're going to be a little bit less lenient about that. Also, socioeconomics does play into it. So there are students who can't afford to take the test or can't afford to prep for it. So they're going to be looking for those students to go test optional. And then students who have an individualized education plan or a neuropsych. So if you know what I'm talking about, then that might be something that you have for your high school education. That's another reason to consider test optional. But generally, if you take it maybe once and you don't get great grades, that isn't the best reason to go test optional. Test optional, again, if you don't meet any of those other criteria, it's really for people who struggle, have pretty severe test anxiety. And in that case, you contextualize why you didn't take the exam. So as I said before, I cannot emphasize enough, try to take one official exam at the very least. If you're going for the more competitive colleges, then you can take it 2 or 3 times. Just be aware of your stress level, okay? We know that academics and grades are always going to be an important factor in admission. Extracurriculars, like I was saying, colleges are putting a little bit more weight on extracurriculars now. They really want to see that students are involved in their high school or in their community. Essays, which I'm going to get into, are incredibly important. Letters of rec, like I already mentioned, interviews, and campus visits, which I'm going to get into in a little bit, is very important. Another thing, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more later as well, is what we call saturation of certain majors. So if I asked you to guess, you'd probably be able to, right? A big thing that we're seeing a current uptick in is computer science engineering. Over the last few years, I've seen a huge uptick in nursing. So those majors, the GPAs are going to become inflated, for students applying into that. So you have to be very careful when applying into certain majors or certain programs at schools where maybe they only take 50 to 100 students as opposed to other programs. And again, I'll get into that later. We also want to talk about how you apply, if you apply early or later in the admission cycle. I'll get into that. Applying to more colleges than you would. And this is very interesting. We want to make sure that you're applying to real safety schools. And we use this term yield protection. So colleges have to sort of answer for how many students they admit versus how many students they enroll. Okay, so yield protection is when a college looks at your profile and they say, you're applying to us as a safety. No, thank you. So they don't accept you because your profile so exceeds their own and they don't think you're a likely candidate. So they protect their yield by not admitting you. So that is a very important thing to consider, especially if you have a particularly high GPA and SAT or ACT score. You don't want to be applying to safety schools that you think that you 100% will not go to. So you want to make it more realistic. Okay. The rest of the takeaways, I hate saying this, but it seems to be getting harder and harder every year. It doesn't mean that there aren't reliable ways to get in. It's just, there are more applicants applying to more schools. The Common App sort of started that trend a long time ago. Like when I applied to college, I applied to like 5. With the Common App, you can apply to 20 with a click of a button. So it's changed the landscape significantly. So there are more people applying to the schools. When we look at rates of deferrals, so that means that you apply early potentially into the college and they defer you to regular admission. We're seeing more of that. And if you look at what I have cited here, we saw that early decision applicants rose by 22% at Brown, 23% at UPenn, 29% at Dartmouth, and 49% at Columbia. Yale and Harvard, right, their applications under what's called restrictive early action, they jumped by 38 and 57% respectively. That's a huge jump. So we have to keep in mind what the landscape looks like when we apply to colleges. And students are definitely applying earlier just across the board. And as I was saying before, the standardized tests are, we want to look at when colleges say that it's optional but preferred with standardized testing. I've seen that quite a few times. University of Michigan was one I saw this year. If you look here at the University of Pennsylvania, 75% of students admitted in the early rounds submitted test scores. Only 25% didn't. So that's, again, speaking to what I was saying earlier about what test optional actually means. Okay. I'm going to So for the 8th or 10th graders in the room, one of the things that as a guidance counselor, I think about a lot is how to prepare for colleges without stressing students out too much. It occupies way too much of my time thinking about this. But the way I've learned to kind of the way I've learned to think about preparing for these elite schools if you want to apply to them, but also making sure that you really enjoy all of high school is by thinking about opening and closing doors. So for students who maybe want to apply to these elite colleges, thinking about defining goals is really, really important. Okay. So you sit down with your students, or you sit down with your parents, and you say, what am I interested in? Do I seem to be like maybe leaning a little more humanities, or do I seem to be leaning a little bit more STEM? You think about, do I maybe want to attend a really prestigious college, or I'm just not ready to think about that yet? Making goals is really important. So when I sit down with a younger student, I say, okay, well, if they don't know too much about college, I explain that what their courses look like, to them in context of their school. And I say, well, if they say, oh, I really hate English, I'm like, do you find that you struggle with the material? Really like dig into what's causing, students to dislike or really like subjects. Sometimes students just like subjects because they're naturally good at it. So I really talk to my students about exploring their interests and not avoiding things because maybe they need a little bit of help in it. As somebody who like fervently avoided science, as I got older, I very much wish I hadn't done that. I realized it was one bad experience that pushed me away from that. So really try to keep the doors open. Another big thing that I recommend for 8th through 10th grade planning is just getting yourself out there, right? Join some clubs. Don't let fear get in the way of not joining clubs. Don't let a club with maybe 2 students be the reason you don't do the club. Start a club if you don't see something that you like. So really just pushing that exploration is so, so critical at a younger age, because with a lot of my 11th graders, they'll be like, oh yeah, I didn't really do anything in 9th grade. And I totally get that because that was me. But now that in retrospect, I have the ability to look back and say, I wish I had pushed myself. So push yourselves. Or if your parents in the room, try to push students to really just explore those clubs and maybe volunteer activities they wouldn't have tried without a little bit of a push. Another thing is getting to know Naviance. A lot of my younger students will be like, I didn't know I had a Naviance account. Now, at some schools, they actually don't open it up till you're in 11th grade, so that's fair. But if you are somebody you have Naviance since 8th, 9th, or 10th grade in high school, get to know it a little bit. It's got some really great information about colleges on there. It's got a lot of information about your school and classes you can take. So definitely go get to know Naviance a little bit better. Okay. Another thing is test prep. Okay. As I was saying before, I think what can make tests difficult, especially for my like late 10th, early 11th grade students, is not having exposure to it. So for my younger students, I usually really try to recommend taking, like I said, a PSAT 8-9 or a pre-ACT. And even if it's not so much to get a high score, it's to just understand what the test looks like so that you're not taken aback by it by the PSAT potentially in 10th grade. So the more you're exposed to it, I find that that's usually better. And then with test prep, right? So it's exposure, I'd say in 8th and 9th grade. And then, if in 10th grade and 11th grade, when you're taking the PSAT again, one of the things that I like to think about is, if you are a really good testing candidate, if you get a certain score on the PSAT, you have a chance to get a National Merit Scholarship. I highly recommend, if you're a good test taker, that's a great opportunity to go for. And again, using this, so when I was talking about getting involved in the community, talking about the summer tends to be a big one. I am definitely a proponent of, enjoy yourself, go on vacation, do the fun stuff, but reserve a week, reserve a little bit of time to do an exploratory program. Most colleges, especially in the wake of COVID, offer both online and in-person, like week-long classes, 2-week-long classes. I had a student, a 9th grader, take a class at William and Mary on Bitcoin, and it was like life-changing for her. So it's really fun to use that summer break to just learn about something that you're really, really interested in. So I highly, highly recommend that. And again, getting out there. Volunteering is pretty hard sometimes for kids who are under 16. So if you can volunteer as a family, just try something like a Habitat for Humanity, something like that. It's definitely a great use of your time, and it will never ever go to waste. It's going to be enriching, and it's going to be helpful on the college application. And the last piece, just want to talk about prioritizing. This is what I was talking about in the beginning. So just, again, making sure that students aren't avoiding certain classes because they're worried about it, or potentially even overtaxing themselves to the point where then maybe that they'll hurt their GPA. Okay, so as I was talking about before, it's all about balance and challenging yourself appropriately. 11th and 12th graders in the room. So one of the things that we want to think about first is creating a balanced list. So I'll talk a little bit more about safeties, targets, and reaches in a moment, but making sure that the list is comprised of all of these pieces is incredibly important. Okay, and as I said before, being realistic when it comes to safeties. Safeties should be schools where your GPA is above what the average incoming GPA is, but it should be a school at the end of the day that you want to go to. A safety isn't a safety if you don't want to go to it. Okay, so that's
今晚一是吃宫保 pasta，要不吃
so that's one of the most important things I would like to reiterate. Another big one is making sure that the college fits you academically and socially. This is probably the biggest deal breaker I find for students. As someone who grew up in a very small town where I graduated with 3 towns combined for a graduating class of 200, my alma mater, Northeastern, was incredibly overwhelming. I almost didn't make it through the first year. I was so overwhelmed by being with 14,000 undergrad students on my campus. It was too much. So that social piece is a really, really big deal. I find that students who, again, come from small schools, like they need to make sure that they understand what it's like to go into a larger environment. And then students who are in larger environments, I often find they telling me they want to go to big schools, but I'm like, go check out the little guys. Sometimes it's really nice for you to walk into a classroom and the professor knows exactly who you are. So that social fit is incredibly, incredibly important. Making sure that there's clubs on campus that you like. Do you want a campus where everybody's there all the time, or do you want a campus where everybody's going to leave on the weekend? This is a very, very big deal, especially if you're going far away. Okay. I'm going to talk about applying early in timeline in a moment, and visiting. That's going to be incredibly important. But one of the things I do want to think about, or I want students to think about now, is leveraging their contacts and thinking about their support network. So again, you might know people who've gone to colleges, go talk to them. Do you have friends or who are at a college now? Go visit them. And a big thing I like to do when I visit a college is eat there. I don't know what it does to my students, but for whatever reason, eating there either kind of like seals the deal, or they're like, I don't know how I feel about this place. So I always recommend that. And then thinking about like advocates. So when we think about our recommendation letters, for example, again, we go with teachers from core subjects when possible, but also think about the student or the teachers who lead clubs, right? So I'll have a student who maybe can't decide between their math and their science teacher, but they're in the science teacher is the faculty representative for one of their clubs and they hang out a lot more. That's a really good recommendation to get. So that person's going to be an advocate. Maybe a parent is an advocate. I have a lot of students who have learning differences who are really amazing self-advocates. So I want you to think about that. Think about who are the people who are going to back you up, and make sure you're surrounding them surrounding yourself with them in the college process, because it brings up a lot of stuff, the college process. If there's things that, they're going to ask about, whether or not parents are married, they're going to ask about siblings. I very rarely have a cycle where I don't have students, who all of a sudden realize they're like, oh, I have to talk about this really personal stuff, and it hits really hard. So make sure you've got a good support network when you're doing this. Okay. And then I'm going to talk about writing and timeline in a moment. I know it's a lot to digest. Okay, demonstrated interest. This is the one I want to talk about for everybody in the room. Everybody sitting here can do this right now, okay? One of the silver linings of COVID is the virtual info session. That really wasn't available before COVID. And now students have the ability to visit schools in California, right? Schools that are really far away, visiting schools across the country that you wouldn't have been able to normally get to. So the virtual info session is great because there's a little bit of data mining involved there, right? So when you go to sign up for it, They're going to say, what's your name? What's your email? What major are you interested in? Let them data mine you early and often. Because when a college goes to look at different applicants, they're going to be like, oh, cool, this student took a tour when they were in 10th grade. Oh, look, they came back for an info session in 11th grade. This matters, okay? Especially, you know, this thinking of a school in the area, American University loves demonstrated interest. So definitely going to the virtual info sessions is incredibly helpful. And I will have students be like, how do I do that? Just Google it, like Google virtual info session, American University, that's it. Okay. Completing online requests for information is incredibly important. Sign up for the newsletter, opt in for emails, but I would personally start a college email for yourselves, like, Krista college 2023 at gmail.com, because getting your inbox inundated is a skill I think that everybody needs to learn. It's, and it can hit adults as much as it can hit students. So really think about that. And then don't sign up for the schools that you're maybe super not interested, and don't be afraid to hit unsubscribe when you don't want to be inundated, because colleges offer some really cool stuff in those emails. They might say, hey, we're offering an overnight. For my students who come from underrepresented ethnicities and races, a lot of times they do fly-in programs. So you want to be looking out for that kind of stuff. And it's often in these emails, and it's usually like highlighted and bolded, but it's like maybe a couple sentences down, so my students will miss it. So create a college email and make sure that everybody in the household has access to it, so that parents and students can go reading through and deleting the things they don't want and keeping the things they do. I find that's where your support network is really, really helpful. Okay. So after you do these initial, you're signing up, you're doing virtual info sessions, maybe liking their pages on Facebook, Twitter, like I'd say Instagram's a real big one now. Then you want to try to do the in-person visit if it's close enough and you have the means to get there. I think spring break is an amazing time to do that, because spring break in high school doesn't align with spring break in college. And that's when you can go and really see what campus looks like. The summer, even though that's when you have more free time, is not the best time to go because there's fewer students on campus. And a lot of my students will tell me that they didn't like the vibe of the campus. And I'm like, no, you didn't see the vibe of the campus. So I usually, if you can take a long weekend here or there, or utilize those 3-day weekends, sometimes that's helpful. And then attending info sessions, like a live info session, is really great, because those are usually run by the admissions reps, the people who are going to read your application. So I highly recommend that. And my favorite piece of this, my students hate when I say it, but write a thank you email. I can't emphasize that enough. So, I'll think that I've really engaged with a student when I used to run admissions tours, and then I don't hear anything. But the students who did, they'll send me an email back and be like, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our time. It sticks. I've had a lot of really good back and forth via email with some students that I was working with for admissions. So I highly recommend that. And I also highly recommend doing your research before you write that email and before you enter the info session. I think one of my biggest pet peeves when I was running info sessions, like, it's MIT, right? And they'd be like, do you have chemistry? I'm like, yeah, we have chemistry, right? Don't roll into a school that is like famous for something and then ask if they have that thing. So you want to be asking questions that are going to help everybody in the room. A great question would have been like, I'm interested in biology and chemistry. Do I apply undecided? Do I double major? What do you recommend for people who have interests in more than one thing? What do you recommend for people who aren't sure what to do? Always ask a question that's going to help everybody else out in the room. And also a question that isn't like that you could have just done research for on the website. Also, don't ask about the food. They'll talk about it. You'll learn about it on the tour. Just, I would leave that be. You'd be surprised how often that comes up. Okay. Talking about timeline now. Okay. So even if you're a parent of an 8th through 10th grader or a student in 8th through 10th grade, this is actually really important for you guys as well to be thinking about timeline, because I find that the college application timeline surprises people as they're applying. So the earliest that you can generally apply to college is in October. UNC is pretty, and like a couple of the other schools in the South are will have earlier admissions deadlines sometimes, priority admissions like in October 15th sometimes. So you want to really be prepared for that, because starting an application on October 1st for something that's due October 15th seems like a lot of time, but then all of a sudden maybe your recommendations won't get in time. You haven't asked soon enough. The school has 5 essays all of a sudden, and you're trying to put that together quite quickly. So you really want to be preparing for that timeline by, you know, visiting schools in 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade, and really thinking about beginning that process in 11th grade so that by 12th grade, you're ready to just apply. So our early action and early decision generally come in October, November, sometimes December. I think the most popular deadline for early decision is probably November 1st or 15th. Early decision is a really interesting way to apply because it's binding. So that means when you apply early decision to a college, you're saying, I will, without a doubt, come to your college in the fall. This is a very important thing because I was talking about yields before and larger application pools. Colleges know that students who are, especially, you know, students who have really high GPAs and test scores, or maybe they've got some, maybe they're excellent athletes, they know they can be applying to other schools. So when you tell them that you're coming, that changes things a little bit, right? So early decision is an incredibly powerful tool. So you do want to be thinking about, you know, if something is your dream school, then you might want to consider early decision. However, you are telling the college as well that you will accept financial aid that they offer. So, you know, if you choose something, I don't know, like Sarah Lawrence, which is $70K a year, you've got, and they don't give you a lot of aid, it's going to be very hard to get out of that binding agreement, near impossible, unless you've got extenuating circumstances. Okay. Early action is generally the same timeline as early decision, but it's not binding. Generally, we use early action to tell colleges that we really, really like them, or you're using it for the safeties that you truly like. So you're telling them, you know, I really like you, I'm going to apply early, and the colleges get that. They know that that students are prioritizing them a little bit. Okay. Then regular decision is generally January through February. The most common deadlines I've seen in the last few years are January 1st, January 5th, and January 10th. I am seeing some schools stretching to February 1st and 15th now. That's a recent development, but the majority of schools are still in January. This is another reason why I really recommend that you apply as early as you can for a lot of schools, because otherwise that winter break is going to be very, very difficult if it's spent applying and applying and applying, and all of a sudden students are done applying and they get a 1-day reprieve, you know, on sometimes not even a day, and then they have to go back to school. So applying early is for the best. And then finally, rolling admissions. Students will look at the rolling admissions and be like, "Ooh, great, I don't have to apply till like July 26th. No, it's on a first come, first serve basis for admissions and also for financial aid. So I use rolling admissions very much like I would treat early action. I apply as early as we can for those schools so that you're upping the chance to get money, and you're upping the chance for there to be seats available for what you're interested in. I very rarely see rolling schools for like nursing, but that's a strategy I really like because obviously the seats fill up quite quickly for that program. Okay. And then I was talking about before having different types of school, right? Our safety, our target, and our reaches. Generally, our safety is where your GPA and SAT are above the average admissions coming in. Target is where you're meeting it, right? And reach is where it exceeds what your current GPA or SAT is. Or they're in that like top 20 schools, or a school that only maybe admits about between like 5 and 15% of their population. That's always going to be a reach no matter where you apply. Generally, you want to consider applying ideally to 9 schools or more. I think 12 is a great number. I have seen students do 15 and 20. I will say, like, if you had asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said, please don't apply to that many. But if you are a particularly competitive student, or maybe you're a student kind of in the middle and you're not sure if you're going to be accepted, applying to more, casting that net wide is a thing that you need to be doing these days, because again, we're seeing bigger applicant pools. Okay. And you want to think about what's doing or what's best for you, right? Each student has different profiles, different goals. Don't compare yourself to anybody else in this process. That's another really, really big piece of advice that I'd like to give out here, because students will often say, oh, well, I know so-and-so is also applying to this school and they're really good at this, or, I can't apply because we're also applying to the same major. The only person you want to consider is yourself. Okay, so everybody has something going on at home, maybe that you don't know about, or different aspects of their life you don't know about. So don't make those direct comparisons. Think about your goals and who you are, and make sure the college is a good fit for you. Think about what your values are. What do you value and what do you want to get out of college? Okay, and that's a big part of being honest with yourself, right? A college that seem like a dream school one year, maybe it doesn't align with your values, you find out. So getting married to a specific school in this process is also not super helpful. So just always remain open, okay? And as I've been saying over and over, start early and stay organized. I think college applications is probably the biggest challenge to executive functioning. Even for somebody who is highly organized, all of a sudden you're adding the equivalent of like a part-time job onto that. It's a lot, okay? And another big piece, and this is definitely anybody of or all grades can be participating in this, is researching programs. Okay, this is what I was going back to before, like thinking about things like computer science or engineering. So if you look at the example below, we've got Carnegie Mellon University. Okay, they've got an admit rate of about 20%. If you look at the chart here, these are the different colleges on the left. We have like the information school and the engineering program. And if you look at the number of applicants to each of these programs and the acceptance rate, right? And then look at how many enroll. The acceptance rate varies quite drastically among different schools. So I highly recommend that you consider looking very specifically at your interests at each school. I'll give you I think one of the better examples is business. So, at certain schools you can major in business, but then if you apply to like Babson, for example, or Bentley, there isn't a business major because those are business oriented undergrads. So you're going to apply to something like econ or finance. And that's when my students go, oh, wait, maybe business isn't what I want. Maybe I actually am an econ major. Also consider your intersections with other interests. So, for me, if I could go back and kind of do it all again with my interests, I actually probably would have gone into something like computational linguistics. I became a journalism major purely because I could write, right? But then I realized, like, if I had thought about my other interests, something like that, which is a hybrid of my interests, would have been really cool. So don't just silo yourself into one major. Look at how look at all the majors at each school, and then say, ooh, do I like maybe this one and this one? Maybe you're a candidate for a dual program. Maybe you're a candidate for an interdisciplinary program. So don't silo yourself early and then potentially get caught in this maze of smaller acceptance rates, especially for my engineering and computer science folks in the room. I can't reiterate that enough. Okay, my very favorite topic, essays. So for your admissions person, I really want you to think about your admissions person when you write the personal statement, because they read these. There's not a single admissions essay at one point where like I've read them all of the people in my territory, I read them, and it's so make it or break it. It allows me to understand that person outside of the paper, like that I see, right? Like I get the resume and I've gotten their grades, and I can see what they do, but I don't really know who they are. And when you're at high level admissions, especially with the Ivies and some of the schools that only take a few, maybe a few thousand students a year, they need to be building a class that's going to work together. So, you can't have too many introverted English majors in a year, right? You're going to need some extroverted people to do the talking. So you got to be thinking about all these pieces. They need geographic diversity. They need diversity of personality. And that's where the essay matters. The essay is not a resume. I'm going to say that again. The essay is not a resume. It is not a place to show off all of your achievements. It's a snapshot into who you are and what you value. I've read so many good essays in my time, but really quick, I want to like highlight just two. There's one essay I read about a student and her clamming boots. And she wrote about how she had to give her clamming boots to her younger sister because she was going to school for engineering and leaving the family business. And her essay didn't end, like it didn't wrap up in a little bow. I mean, her family ended with her saying her family was pretty upset with her for not going into the family business and how she was going to try to go into engineering and maybe bring some ways to refine the industry. She wanted to bring that back home eventually. But like I said, the essay didn't say, okay, like everything's great now. It just said, you know, I'm doing this for myself and it's going to upset the people I love. Right? And that was powerful. I've also read really funny ones. I had a student write about the worst quinceañera ever, about how all of her family members tried to plan her quinceañera for her. And by her fun, like it was funny the way she would sort of reject their ideas and input her own. I got to learn a lot about her through what she decided would be the perfect quinceañera for herself. So again, the essay doesn't have to be about, and oh, this is a big one. Students always ask me, they're like, well, nothing bad has happened to me. That's a big one that I've been getting the last few years. It's not about that. Yes, there are people out there who have had some significant trauma and it has affected who they've become as a person. Of course, if that's so vital to who you are that you need to talk about it, completely fine. But again, if you're somebody, you know, I've had students be like, I've had a good life. I have nothing to write about. No one should be saying that. It's a story about you. I wrote about my town fighting over a traffic light. Like I came from this tiny little town where we're like, oh no, we can't have that traffic light. I rely on humor and that's what my essay was about. It's just, I used my humor to describe why I needed to go to a bigger area to just get out of my town for a little bit before I came back. Okay. And it's just, I love descriptions. Anytime you can use dialogue or descriptions of, or smells, you know, use those senses, okay? But don't get boxed in by thinking that you have to write about tragedy or you have to write about how, you know, amazing your internship was. Sure, if it affected who you are as a person and you learned a lot, great. But otherwise, write about that family vacation that changed how you or your relationship with your sibling and really like made you grow as a person. Whatever is going to talk about what you value is what matters in this. Okay. Also, I would highly, highly, highly recommend you be finished with the personal statement by September. Sometimes I do notice that juniors will write their essay a little early and then all of a sudden get into it like later in their junior year and they're like, ooh, that's not what I want to write about. So, you know, begin thinking about it, but you want to shoot to write that essay like late spring, maybe early summer of your junior year. Okay. And then this piece with the other essays, I'm going to actually get into that in a moment. Okay. Supplements. These are the essays that surprise my students sometimes. These are the general essays like why major? So why have you chosen a major? Why are you choosing our school? What have you done to influence your community? How will the college's community influence you? This can throw my students because, you know, some colleges like my alma mater, for example, doesn't have any additional essays. You can just apply to Northeastern. But some colleges like Princeton, I think has like 8. I've got my favorite is the University of Chicago, which is just like, what wisdom does a wisdom tooth have, right? Like sometimes it's just going to throw you. So you need to be thinking about supplements fairly early, especially because what sometimes my students will write something about in their personal statement and all of a sudden that's maybe better as a Y major. So that's something to be thinking about. I'm going to give you an example here of a supplement from Cornell. They say that students in the arts and sciences embrace the opportunity to delve into multifaceted academic interests, embodying in 21st century terms Ezra Cornell's Any Person, Any Study founding vision. Tell us about the areas of study you are excited to explore and specifically why you wish to pursue them at our college. Okay, so this is kind of what I was talking about. Like sometimes I'll have a student write an entire personal statement about why major, and then we get to here and they're like, uh-oh. So it's also something to think about as you're doing these. And like I said, they can be incredibly random from where's Waldo to what's your favorite word and why. One of my favorites was what's the name of your food truck and what are you selling? I would have killed for these questions when I was applying, but some students would rather not have them. So supplements are a really great area for you to tell a college that you really love them and you've been searching in depth on their website to tell them how much you like them. Okay, so just a plain old Google search is not going to cut it for this. You really have to be doing some research into each college. And I think this takes more time than students expect. Okay, so preparing for this early is very, very helpful. Okay, so I know that's a lot. And I'm going to take questions in a few minutes, but you know, the biggest piece of advice here, maintaining a good GPA, right? Don't shy away from courses you're afraid of, but also don't tax yourself to the point where you're going to be dealing with a lot of anxiety or a lot of stress, or you're going to be performing poorly. Okay. Trying to complete the SAT, ACT by the end of your junior year. Okay. Building a resume. And again, this isn't like a resume that a 30-year-old would have. This is like, do some clubs, do some volunteering, push yourself to do a program. Are you at summer camp that you've loved? Good. Become a counselor in training when you're old enough. Okay. So think about longevity and depth and really giving a lot to what you love and maybe giving back, right? By becoming a leader or exposing new community members to your community or vice versa. And that's what I was saying, like, get life experience, like get out there. I know it's really hard, especially, you know, in this post-COVID time to want to stay in, or I mean, maybe it's the opposite, you want to get out, but you know, do the thing that you were afraid to do, or keep going with a club, you know, like maybe you did something for 2 years and it's going to conflict with your schedule. Talk to your guidance counselor. Okay. So now's the time to just really focus on challenging yourself appropriately. And if you're telling a college, right, you're a business major, try to get a part-time job, right? If you're interested in computer science, try to learn another programming language, but show those colleges that you are trying to take an interest before you apply in as a certain major. Okay, maybe you'll have the opportunity to study abroad. Maybe you can do a summer pre-college program. Okay, but the important part is to just start thinking about it. Even if you're in 8th, 9th, 10th grade, start thinking about it early so that when you get there, it's not as stressful as it can be if you hadn't really thought about it before. Okay. So before I take questions, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we do. Okay. As someone, as a college consultant, I like to describe myself as what a guidance counselor would be if a guidance counselor had infinite time and could do the job they always wanted to do. I love sitting with my 8th, 9th, and 10th graders and going through their course lists and thinking about cool summer opportunities. I love creating emails with them to email doctors in the area so they could maybe shadow with them. So I work as, again, what a guidance counselor would do if guidance counselor had time. I'm also a mediator, I'm a counselor, right? Sometimes I'll find that a parent can say things 50 times and then the guidance counselor says it and they're like, oh, okay, I'll do that, right? So sometimes you just need somebody else to say the thing that you've been saying. Sometimes the college process can get pretty fraught between parents and students, and we're there to be that person who has to kind of take that on, right? I'm also like, I'm not going to say personal assistant because I'm not an assistant, but what I do is I do keep a calendar for students, right? So I'm like, okay, it's been a week, let's do this thing. All right, let's write this essay ahead of time. And because it's not the parent asking, because it's me asking, usually it gets done a little bit faster. So I'm there to push a timeline so that nobody is dealing with the kind of stress that I was talking about if you hadn't really engaged with the process before. Okay, so I'm there to help my students put their best foot forward. I love crafting narratives with my students. It's probably my favorite part of what I do. We'll talk and talk, and then all of a sudden they'll say something, and I'm like, that's your personal statement right there, right? That's how we're going to craft a narrative that tells a college that you love this major, or that you're right for that college, or that college is right for them. Okay, so that's a big part of what we do, is writing those narratives. And then just prepping my students for the stuff that can be a little intimidating. I think interviews, no matter how old or experienced you are, can be a little intimidating. So I'm there to do that. And I'm there for you know, even the times that can be a little rough, like maybe they've been deferred or waitlisted, I'm there to show them how they can still put that best foot forward in that process. Okay, so as a consultant, we're there again, we're your support network, we're your champion, we're your mediator, we're your counselor, but we're there to help with all of those pieces to make it easier on the family in general. Okay, so I'm going to go over to questions now. Give me one moment. And if you've been sitting on a question, now's the time to put it in the chat. Okay. Okay, if ED, this is a great question. If ED is binding, can you apply to multiple schools ED or just pick one? So some schools are actually, that's a great question. So some schools are actually quite specific about that. So you can only apply to early decision at one school only, okay? So some students, oh my goodness, I just saw the second question, sorry. Some students, or some colleges allow students to apply to several state schools. So there's something called restricted early action. They'll say you can apply to public universities, but you can't apply early to other private universities. So you always want to look at what the college is stipulating when they say that you're applying early action, early decision, or regular decision. Okay. All right, let me go to the next question. Okay, best guidance for a junior to put together a resume. Any resume building apps? Oh yes, my hands down favorite for this is Canva. Get friendly with Canva. It's magic. It's pure magic, especially for someone like me who doesn't really like design elements. Like I'm as far from an artist as you're gonna get. Canva is my new best friend. It's free and you literally just like type in resume and then it populates with all these cool resumes. I've been recommending lately that my students use a picture in their resumes. I think it's especially, you know, if I had had that ability when I was reading college applications, I think I would have really liked that. It really adds something to it. If you're, you know, more private and you don't want to, that's completely fine. But Canva does give you the option to do all that. So I highly recommend that. And this is a really great follow-up question. How important is a social media presence when applying to a college? Can it work against a student? So I have students who have zero digital presence and I have students who have quite big digital presence. What I would say is if you're going to have a big digital presence, it better be a positive one, right? So if you like to do your TikTok and you want to dance, fine. That's not like if you're just going to do a nice little dance, no one's going to hurt you, right? Or it's not going to hurt you in the application process. But like I have students who have started entire businesses online. Like that's super cool. So yeah, sure, it's okay to have a digital presence. Just make sure, you know, especially if you have like a publicly shared application, you want to make sure that that content is appropriate. I have some students who, you know, like they've friended me on things like that after they've graduated and I'm like, whoa, that's some content right there, right? And that's the kind of stuff you'd be surprised what college admissions folks can find. So be cognizant of that. Okay. Let me go to the next question. That was great. Okay. Oh, somebody asked how early decision 2 works. That's a great question as well. So so some colleges have early decision 1 and early decision 2. So early decision 1 is actually, so to give you an example, the Ivy Leagues don't have an early decision 2. I mean, yes, and not have an early decision 2, they only have an early decision 1. So I feel like early decision 2 was created to capture that applicant pool, right? So early decision 2 is also binding. So you can apply early decision 1, and if you don't get in or you get what's called deferred to regular admission, you can still apply early decision 2 at another school. It just means that that school will then be binding. I think early decision 2 is a great option. And I will say what I saw kind of in general this year was my students who applied early decision 1, for example, at schools that were not Ivy Leagues actually did pretty well in that area. And that's because those colleges recognize that those students really could kind of get in a lot of places and they valued that. And early decision 2, right? You're telling a college that you also, you value them. Maybe you did consider another college before, but they still understand, you know, students have to apply to a lot of places. So early decision 2 is incredibly powerful as well. So you have that option. And even if you don't apply ED1, you can still apply ED2. Maybe you weren't ready by November 1st and you want to apply somewhere by early decision 2, which is actually generally the same as regular decision. It's usually around January 1st. So, and it's still okay to apply to the other school's regular decision at that point. Okay. I have someone asking about, okay, so what we generally do with juniors. So when we work with students or who are juniors in high school, and actually those are my most common grade I work with is 11th graders. We call those admissions students. And with my 11th graders, I'm doing a lot of the pieces that I can get done as early as I can. So I'm generally working on a resume with my juniors. I try to get that done quickly. And then I start working on the Common App. Again, that's the Common application where you can apply to a lot of colleges through. I'll begin working on it on those like sort of administrative pieces with them. And then I start really getting into brainstorming the personal statement and even the supplements, because a lot of the supplements, they either don't change from year to year, or like I have yet to get a student who would go through a season without having to answer why major, right? So there's certain supplements that we can definitely start early and get that done with. And then this is good, like, so we can actually recycle essays. Now that might sound bad, but no college is expecting you to write individual essays for every single school, right? So with something like a Y major, that's not really going to change much from college to college. We're just going to be changing why you want to study that major at that college. So there's a lot you can do with juniors to begin that process now, so that by the time, again, the actual essays come out from the schools, we're pretty much ready to roll at that point. So we call that admissions when we work with juniors. That's a great question. Okay. Since applications are done in early senior year, do APs taken in senior year count, or should they be crammed into grades 9 through 11? Another fabulous question. So APs in senior year do count. They count for two particular reasons in like overall. So first of all, if you said that you've taken an AP course, like eventually you're going to have to report those grades to the college that you go to, right? So you're going to, that could potentially get you advanced standing, right? That's the whole point of advanced placement class. So definitely, you know, if you have the opportunity to still take them in senior year, you know, like AP Spanish is a real popular one with my students, because maybe they get to try a new language in college, or sometimes they even place entirely out of language study in college. So that's a really great reason to do it. And you also have to keep in mind that colleges are going to ask for the year-end grades. I know, you know, I've been in this position, unfortunately, where colleges have rescinded admissions from students who have just decided to kind of like take off the second half of senior year. But to sort of answer that, like cramming it into 9 through 11, generally, if you want the college to see how you perform in it, those are the ones that you're going to want to take a little earlier. So maybe you're a STEM major, right? So maybe we save AP Psych for senior year, something that's important. And that is my background, so I love that AP Psych class. But I would maybe put AP Psych in the senior year and favor something like an AP Calc or an AP Stat earlier, so that I could showcase my scores and my grades to the college earlier, the classes that really matter for your major especially. So that's my recommendation for APs. That's a great question. Foreign language requirement. Give me one moment. Okay. So the foreign language requirement is interesting. So I get this a lot, right? Where my students will have completed pretty advanced standing in middle school, and then all of a sudden maybe they only have to do a year or two in high school and then they're done. So for some students and for some schools, that's fine. Then you get something like a Harvard that really wants you to have 4 years of a language. So in that particular case, what I usually recommend students do is either like take a language that they've been interested in, maybe, you know, starting a little bit like in 11th grade, I actually did this. I capped out of Spanish, so I started Latin 1 because I was interested in English. I've had students start French. So if you're looking for a very specific college, look up their language requirement. That's my biggest suggestion. But yes, there are students who will tap out entirely of their language there, and maybe there isn't really good options for them. And especially if they're going into a major that's not as focused on that, that's okay. But I usually say just talk to your guidance counselor and look at the, like, if you're, again, if you're, maybe you have triple legacy at a school and that's really important to you, you should look at that school before you make that decision. Okay. Okay. This is a great question. What do you expect parents to do in helping their kids explore their interests and pushing their boundaries? That's a fun one to answer, because this is such a great thing to be doing for kids, but it also can be a source of contention among families. So what I would say is, as parents, right, we're there to help, again, our children appropriately challenge themselves. Okay. So if a student is maybe not living up to their potential in an area and they have potential, it's okay to push. But if maybe, there's something that family, like that a family would really like a student to do and they're really railing against it, they're struggling with it, figure out what the source of struggle is before pushing too hard on that, right? So the parent's role is to know your kid, right? Like you want this to be as holistic as possible, and as much as you can give your child agency. Say, okay, you want to be a rocket scientist, cool, let's sign up for this rocket science camp, let's go to a NASA camp, let's go watch the space shuttle lift off in Cape Canaveral, right? So giving a child agency is so important, because then it allows for them to decide for themselves, like to explore it first and then decide for themselves if it's something that's interesting to them. But I have seen a lot of situations where students are really pushed in one direction or another, and it kind of goes the other direction, right? And then all of a sudden they're trying to do completely different things because it's more a reaction to the family than the interest, right? So I just really communicate. Communication is so important, right? In all this. So, students in the room, if you're feeling frustrated, have a chat with your folks, and parents, if you're feeling like, just make sure the lines of communication are open among the family. Okay. That's a big one. That's a great question. Let's see. Oh, okay. So for students who take part in activities that might not be available at their school, I see this frequently with martial arts. They want to know if that's a disadvantage to their application. Absolutely not. So my students who are really interested, I always kind of get embarrassed to admit this, but I was a twirler, and I couldn't do that at my school, but I kept going individually, and because I made it to a certain point, like I made it to nationals at one point, I actually got recruited for college for that. So don't be afraid to stop an activity because it's not available at the high school. The only thing I would say though is just make sure there's balance. If an activity takes up so much time, like unless you're going to be competing in college, or it is so part of your heart and soul that you don't want to do anything else, don't make time, or don't forget to make time for those school clubs, right? It's so important to be in that journalism club or that robotics club, because if you're not involved in your high school at all, that also speaks something. So we want to make sure that you're involved a little bit everywhere. Okay, great question. Okay, so I got another question about sort of like when high schools have a lot of APs and like how many to take. So it's harkening kind of back to that idea of appropriately challenging yourself. So, I have plenty of students, I think, who really can kind of like take a ton of APs, like 15, 16, 17, 18, and they do it and they're fine. But that's not every student. So when you're at a high school like that, again, I think especially with the APs, it's really thinking about your interest area and stress level. Okay. So if a student is like, you can always take a class, right? You can try a class, and there is that small add drop period in high school. Utilize that. Sometimes, AP Physics C is no joke. So go try it. There's no reason to close a door when you could be opening it. But if it doesn't work for you, it's also okay to go to a class. Like if you're going to get a C in an AP class, that's not going to reflect well. So generally, if you can pull off an A, great. You can get that B plus, great. That's where like that B minus C level is where things start to slip. So you don't want to be in a class where you could end up in that position, and then you have to explain that grade to a college, especially if it's a grade in a course that you want to major in, right? So just be judicious about those EP classes and your ability to succeed in them. And that's academically and emotionally. Okay. We never want to forget what what that emotional effect is with stress. Okay. Another great question. So talking about people who come from non-disadvantaged minorities, right? Like so, to be frank, I work with a lot of first generation like Asian Americans families, right? There is something to be said for a saturation of certain majors within those groups. And it's okay to acknowledge that, right? Talk to a guidance counselor, look at the profiles of colleges. They are so proud to say what their percentages of certain races and ethnicities and they love geographic diversity as well. So you do have to be cognizant of the fact, I mean, just to be really like talking about just guys versus girls in STEM, right? It's a big difference. So if you're a first generation Asian American or first or second generation Asian American guy going into computer science, yes, that is a saturated major. So we do want to talk. So you want to, again, think about, you want to be thinking about ways in which your interests dovetail with other majors as well. So man, don't think just straight up computer science. Maybe you have other interests. And I'm just using that because that's one that I hear commonly. So like when I press my students, I'll say, okay, well, what do you love about computer science? And they're like, well, I really want to use it to help people. Okay, so then maybe you're actually an entrepreneur and a computer scientist. Or they'll say, I really want to, I used it to, I had a student who helped use engineering to help actually make respirators during COVID. Okay, well that intersects with biomedical engineering. Okay, so you got to really think about if you are in a group, where there are like looking at me, right? There's a lot of women in English. That's still happening, right? So you want to be thinking about what makes you unique for that major or where your interests dovetail with other things so you can diversify your application. Say, well, I'm interested in this and this and this. And that way colleges say, oh, okay, well, maybe I can't take you for this, but I can put you into this. Okay. And there's always, not all the time, but a lot of colleges, again, once you're in, there's a little bit of room to play around. So you want to be thinking about that. Maybe there's an under-enrolled major that you really, really love that you hadn't been thinking about. Okay. So that's a great question. And it is something that you have to talk about, especially in this oversaturated application time. Okay. So it's a question. So I know a lot of people are Potomac debaters, how does this help for admission for Ivy Leagues? Potomac debaters, a lot of students compete at, national levels. Any extracurricular activity that students participated in that's taking them on that like regional national circuit, that's really, really helpful for colleges, right? Because you're saying, and I'm going to just put a shout out for debate. I really love debate because it really makes makes wonderful critical thinkers and speakers. I love debaters because of that ability to really think beyond the bounds of what's just in front of them and thinking about all the angles. So, I mean, no matter what, I find debate helpful for the college process in general. And for the Ivy Leagues, right, competing at those higher levels, it's also really helpful for interviews. My debaters are wonderful interviewers. So definitely participating in that is something that positively influences my students across the board. Let's see. How frequently we meet with students. So it kind of depends. We work with students in different capacities. Like we have students who kind of go for our bigger package we call comprehensive, where we're meeting more frequently via phone calls to brainstorm essay ideas. We also have students who maybe they're more independent writers and we meet with a little bit less frequently. So like even in 8th through 12th grade, we meet with our younger students, we meet with them quarterly with a combination of face-to-face meetings and email check-ins. With our older students, it really depends. So we have all of our information available. If you'd like to meet with a consultant, we explain everything to you. But unfortunately, I don't have like an exact number for that, for how often we meet with each student, because it really is relative. So that's my college guidance response. Okay, just going back to rolling admissions real quick. So rolling admissions means that the college accepts students on first come, first served basis. So a student applies again as a nursing student, and they're one of the first 10 to apply, like they've got a better chance at a seat, right? But rolling admissions is also there for, I used to work with students who couldn't apply early for a variety of reasons. So rolling admissions was really helpful for my students who needed a minute in the college process, and they applied to those colleges when they were ready to. Maybe so for example, too, like if your grades aren't so great the first semester or the first quarter of your senior year, or the first semester, rolling admissions gives you a little bit of a minute. Maybe you can get through quarter 3 and apply, or you can show off your semester 1 grades a little bit later in the year. So rolling admissions again are for first come, first serve, but they're also there for students who need a little bit of a minute before they apply. Okay. Great questions. I'm getting a couple questions about application. There are several counselors who work for Potomac. I think, yes, we definitely still have room for juniors this fall, so definitely contact us if you're interested. I got a question too about once we come up with a list of colleges like Reach, Safety, etc. Do we hone in on the students' like interest resume? Definitely. That's like one of the first things we have to do, because an application is really incomplete without a resume. I usually talk resume and list at the same time, because list and resume are almost inextricably linked, right? A resume is another version of a narrative. So if a student, for example, is applying as I'm just gonna go with nursing again, a nursing major, but their application says that they're they've been doing a lot of research in chemistry. Sure, that could work, right? Like that definitely works, but maybe that student's more of a chem major. Or I'll have students who have a ridiculously math, like they love math, it's so clear, and they're like, I'm gonna apply philosophy. I'm like, I don't know if that's gonna work, right? Because then the college is like, are you just applying to an under-enrolled major to get in? So the college list and the resume are so intertwined, because they do have to align with each other in some respects. Okay, like some colleges are more STEM oriented, some are more humanities oriented. So you got to be careful about how you apply and how your resume looks in that context. That's also a great question. Somebody hit on my favorite topic. Thank you. Some mental health tips for the college process, not feeling overwhelmed. Yes, yes, yes. So I think the biggest things that cause stress in the college process, so number one, always hands down all the time, is timing. It's so hard to push yourself to do something that isn't due until January. Like I get it, or like November. Yes, I get it. But there are no words to describe what it feels like when you go to fill out an application at you go to submit your application at 11:50 or before an 11:59 deadline, and you realized you missed an entire essay because you hadn't looked at the application before. That happens. So starting early reduces tears. Keep that in mind. Another piece is, again, having a conversation together about colleges. It's not uncommon that I'll sit down with a parent and they'll tell me one thing, and they sit down the student and they're like, yeah, it's this other thing, right? So then I'm like, ooh, who am I going to be like, how do I navigate this, right? So being open with each other is so important. And parents, just remember, and again, if there's been a divorce, or someone has passed away, or there's a tough relationship between siblings or something like that, they ask about marriage dates and divorce dates, and like, you'd be surprised what comes up. So you do have to be prepared, not only for your child to experience some some emotional unrest, but also for you as a parent. That's hard, and you want to be prepared for that in this process. Okay, so support each other. That's my last piece, is just support each other and go visit colleges together and make it fun. Make it fun. Go eat at the dining hall. You're gonna go up to Boston, right? Take a ride in a duck boat. Go eat at Northeastern's cafeteria. I have to say, our food is better than Boston University, as I'll say that a million times over. But like, have some fun. Don't just make it a college thing. And students in this room, okay, when you're looking at colleges and doing these info sessions, it's not a chore. It's not homework. It's shopping for where you're going to live. Okay, so you got to keep yourself in that mindset. or otherwise it's gonna, when it becomes a chore, I find that my students put it off. Okay, so that's my biggest piece of advice there is don't make it a chore. Just be like, yay, I could live here soon, right? Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, so students who sort of have like blips on their record in like a variety of different cases, right? So maybe they've been competing for a long time and they do poorly. Do you tell a college about that, right? Or maybe you've got a blip in your transcript. So you want to, again, thinking about your narrative. Okay, so if you have like an event, maybe where you did poorly, but it was quite hard to get to that event, might still want to talk about it, right? And then contextualize the event. Maybe that becomes a supplement. Maybe you say, you know, a lot of colleges ask about like failure and resilience, right? And responding to failure or challenge. So maybe that's something that you write about. You say, you know, I messed up here, or I didn't prepare for this thing, or I thought I was going to be great, and then all of a sudden it wasn't, right? That honesty is so important to colleges. So I highly recommend, you know, if you've been in a situation where something didn't work out, it's okay to write about it. I mean, it's okay to list it, but also write about it. But also, you know, if you had a rough year in high school, I mean, especially with COVID, I don't know a lot of people who didn't at this point. It's okay to talk about that. There's an entire section called the additional information section on the Common App to contextualize anything that you've been through. They have a section for COVID, and they have a section for just anything in general. I've had students who have had illnesses. I have students who have had personal things happen that's affected their grades. It's okay. This is life. It's okay to contextualize that. So you don't, unless it's like something that is a blip and you wouldn't have to really talk about it, I usually go towards talking about it, but contextualizing it. That's a great question too. Okay, this is a question, and this is great. So, how much of a percentage does the early decision increase admissions chances? I wish I could answer that, but I can't. But some colleges you actually can, they're very forthright about that information, and some colleges aren't. Like Bryn Mawr, which is, or and Haverford Swarthmore, if you've heard of these colleges, they're in Pennsylvania. They're highly competitive. They actually say that right straight up that they take 40% of their class early decision. So that's, you want to look at that that kind of information. So sorry. So some colleges publish it. You also can talk to guidance counselors and people like me. We usually know which colleges. I am so sorry. Give me one. Too much talking. Sorry. So yeah, you can research that. Sorry about my voice. One moment. So someone's asking about our general results for students who have applied to like top 10 universities. Our acceptance rate is generally in the 80s with these students sort of across the board. But again, it's hard to talk about that like per counselor, for example, because like I'll have students, believe it or not, I've had students apply to Ivies. And then, for example, maybe they're, sorry about my voice, maybe they're a debater or they're doing something with sports and they find that they have a better fit at a college that isn't an Ivy. So like acceptances and where students go is very, very different. But generally with our top 10, top 20 schools, our acceptance rates in the 80s, which is actually quite high for that level of admissions. How are the Potomac students doing so far this year? That's a great question too. Like I said, we're seeing that it's a tough year, but we are also seeing that our students who have really, they choose a list that's a good social and academic fit for them, and they apply early and they utilize their support network. I will say, like, I can't give exact results like that, right? Because we're also still waiting for those results to come in. But for me, it's really about making sure a student gets into a college that they want to go to and that they're happy. So the results that I like better are actually, I follow my retention results in college to see where my students are happy. So I'm like, am I placing my students where they're going to do well and thrive? So that's actually really what you want to think about. But again, for specific statistics, you can definitely contact Potomac. Let's see. I got questions about like European and Canadian schools. So all of the different counselors have different strengths. I've worked frequently with Canadian schools. I've worked frequently with European schools. A lot of us do have experience with Canadian schools. It's not similar to the American application, neither is the European application. I actually find that they're just way more straightforward. Americans, we love to talk about like our values and what we love and doing what we love. Like Europe is just like, can you do this thing? Great, let's apply. So I know I'm generalizing a lot, but the application systems for other countries, I think America really kind of does stand out for how much we ask students to write. So grades tend to be a little bit more important with the other universities and experience in a certain area. The Americans definitely are into that sort of like, how do you fit? What do you envision for yourself in the future type thing? So another person saying like they've if they have a difficult time and maybe it doesn't lead to success in the end, can that hurt an application? So generally what I'd say is like, this is what I said before, circumstances don't need to wrap up with a bow. It doesn't need to just, you can't be like, oh, I've ended high school and it's gone well, right? Like sometimes it doesn't end like that. So it's okay to be forthright about something that didn't go well, and maybe you're still in the process of fixing it, right? So it is okay to leave that story unfinished. All the colleges want to know is what you're going to do in the future. Okay, so if something that you've worked really hard on doesn't end the way you want it to, what did you learn and what changes are you going to make and how has it influenced you as a person? That's really, really important. Okay. Let's see. And one of my the final questions, like differences versus speech and debate. I'm actually going to that is a great question to ask our directors of the debate, speech and debate section of this. I actually don't have enough knowledge about speech and debate for myself personally to answer that question, so I don't want to give you any misinformation. Okay, I've got a few more minutes. So does anybody have any final questions? If you want to put them in there, that would be great. Okay. So for students who, again, who maybe fit into that area where they are, you know, they're entering into a saturated major, or they come from a background or ethnicity that's maybe highly represented in a certain area. What about applying to majors where maybe they aren't as well represented? That's a great question. And that can work, but like it's what I was saying before about making sure that the narrative makes sense. So like again, I've had a couple students who were like super engineering and they're like philosophy, like right, it's gotta make sense with the narrative. So for example, like if a student maybe really is into, again, I'll use STEM, right? STEM's a great example because it is very popular, and teachers are pushing students more toward that now, right? So maybe finding a way that the narrative of the resume can be tailored to fit an under-enrolled major. So for example, I've had students who are really interested in the med field. And again, when I ask more questions, they're like, well, I'm really interested in these like differences, in treatment by gender. Okay, then maybe it's gender studies and this other piece, right? So there are ways to find majors that aren't as populated, making that work for your resume. There's also, looking for newer majors is also an interesting one. Like I said, I'm shocked by how many new majors I'm seeing every time I log in to look at a college I know well. All of a sudden I see a new major somewhere because it's meeting a need that hadn't really been met before. So definitely, don't be afraid to explore the bounds of what you're interested in, and then look at your resume and see if that might be tailored a little bit in your favor. Okay, that's a great question. Is it ever too late to start college counseling? No, 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 no. I've worked with students as late as like November and December, like right before we're applying. And yeah, it's a little intense, right? Like, yeah, we have to do a lot quickly, but giving a student a moment to talk about their narrative and who they are, it's never too late for that. So, even just making a personal statement more personal. Okay. Like I even my cousin, all of a sudden I looked at her essay in December and I was like, oh no, 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 no. Because it was just about liking basketball. And I was like, nope. So then we talked a little bit about what basketball meant for her and why she did it. And really it was because it gave her a chance to feel like a leader. That's the essay. Okay. So it's never too late to begin college counseling. It's never too late to sit down and look at that list. So anytime, right? Anything helps for sure. Okay. Is it difficult to change major at the top schools? Great question. Yes, some yes, and some no. So colleges actually will be pretty forthright about that information. So, and it is something, to be honest, ask about that in the information session. But you don't want to make it like, right, you don't want to be like, well, I'm interested in STEM. What if I apply philosophy? No, you'd say, I'm interested in these two very, very different majors. I'm going to apply into one, but what if I like the other one? What do you do? And they'll tell you. Right. So some colleges, if you, let's say, you apply bio, but you want to be in engineering, sometimes that works out really nicely because maybe there's like a biomedical engineering or they dovetail nicely, but sometimes that major is always going to be saturated and they won't have the availability for you to transfer. So you do want to ask colleges about that in the info session for sure. Let's see. So anybody has questions about prices? That's a great question. Please just contact us. We do free consultations for every student. So it's 30 minutes of your time. We'll give you all the prices. Happy to answer any of that. We're very forthright about that. We want to do the consultation with you because it is relative to your student and your situation and how much time you want to spend in this process. Is it too early to start college counseling? Great question. No. And like I said, we as college counselors are cognizant of walking that tightrope between making sure a student is keeping their options open, but also not pressuring them to the point where they'll close some doors out of stress. So it's never too early. And like I said, even if you're not working with us and you just go visit some colleges again as a family, but make it fun because all of a sudden, if it becomes like a trip to look at a future, like students sometimes will get a little weird about that. But I find if you're like, oh, cool, let's go to Colonial Williamsburg and then maybe we'll visit, William and Mary and maybe we'll go eat in that dining hall, right? Make it fun and give students something to look forward to, right? Like, and again, giving them agency. If a student is saying, I really like art. Okay, like you can still be, even if you don't become an art major, you can still become an art loving, biologist, right? Or maybe you get into like medical drawing. So you'd be surprised how often those skills that we have intersect. Like, sure, I twirled. Does it help my college counseling? No, but do I teach twirling actually at a summer camp? Yeah, right. Like, and it's great on my resume and it shows that I work with the community. So you'd be surprised how often those things that we do matter. So start early, have fun with it. That's the biggest piece of advice. Let's see. Okay. I think I'm on one of my last here. Oh yeah, okay. I think I just hit the majority of it. So I'll hang back for another minute, but I just want to thank everybody for listening to me. It's still strange for me to just talk for that long and not have like a back and forth. So thank you guys again for attending. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to just post our contact information one more time. Okay, I'll share screen. Give me one moment. And yeah, feel free to contact us. We're always open and happy to work with everyone. Thank you guys again for coming.